and I'll move the House File 3499 to be before us, and I'll also move the DE 2-1 amendment, and I will have Mr. Gehring walk us through that. But before we do, members, there's in your packet or there should be also a 8 amendment to the DE amendment 2 amendment that basically has to do with a date change, and it's a technical amendment that to modify the amendment. You go on page 5, line 26, where it says December 21st, 2024. That needs to be deleted and insert March 27th, 2022. So as members, do we all understand that? And I guess, do we need to vote on that? If we just can I just modify my amendment, Mr. Gehring?
Mr. Chair, since this is your DE2 amendment, you can just incorporate that into your draft.
Okay, I'll just incorporate that into the draft, that change. And so with that, members, Mr. Gehring, you want to walk through the amendment and where we're at with that?
Sure. So, Mr. Chair, I'll walk through the DE 2-1. This draft is a modified draft based on the collection of amendments you saw last week in the committee. So section 1 is a section that provides some special procedures for the 2020 state primary and state general election. The section applies only to those 2 elections and no others in the future. Subdivision 2, which starts on line 1.9, provides an option for local governments to take a couple of different actions to mitigate the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic. One is to designate polling places up until July 1st of this year, which is an extension of the December 31st usual deadline that is provided in law. The second authority for local governments is to train and designate employees of healthcare facilities and hospitals to administer the absentee voting process within those facilities. So under current law, trained election judges, typically from the county or city, would go into these facilities to administer absentee voting on election day. In this case, the healthcare workers would be trained to do that work. And then the third power that exists for local governments in this bill is to extend the period during which absentee ballots are processed to include up to 14 days prior to the election. And then there's a blank line in there to be filled in by the committee in a minute that allows some processing of absentee ballots after election day. Paragraph B, which you see starting on line 1.21, makes clear that the existing powers that are granted in the election law for local governments to respond to emergencies can apply to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then subdivision 3 allows certain types of election filings to be done electronically. That includes affidavits of candidacy, nominating petitions, including the collection of electronic petition signatures, requests that writing candidates' votes be counted. All can be filed for this particular election cycle in an electronic format. Section 2, which starts on 2.19 of the amendment, delays by a few days the deadline for parties to submit their names of nominated presidential electors for the fall, and this is to reflect the scheduling in late August of the Republican National Convention. And then Section 3 of the DE 2-1 is appropriating the first pot of HAVA money that's been available, and the committee has heard about this one a couple times in the past. This is sometimes known as HAVA 2.0. This is a $7.38 million federal allocation to Minnesota, as well as a $1.4 million state match to go with the federal appropriation. The authorized uses in subdivision 4 include the uses that the committee has seen in the past, and it also includes some additional uses that you'll see in section 4 related to the COVID pandemic. This particular pot of money would be available to the Secretary of State until December 21st of 2024, which is the 5-year window that was allowed in the federal law. And then section 4 is the last appropriation section here. This is the sort of HAVA 3.0 money, which is the money that was made available in March of this year. This is $6.9 million for the state from the federal government, and then the additional $1.3 million 20% state match. The one thing that's a little bit different about this state match requirement is that there's sort of a conditional appropriation here. So there's some discussion of the possibility that the state match requirement will be waived by the federal government in a future stimulus bill. So this language accommodates that and provides that appropriation on July 1st of 2020 if the state match requirement is still in effect on that day. And then the authorized uses you see in subdivision 4, starting on 4.6, are the authorized uses that are more specifically related to the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and includes ensuring health and safety of election officials and voters, including the purchase of sanitation and disinfectant supplies, public outreach and preparations for social distancing in polling places and around election sites, facilitation, support, and preparation for increased absentee voting that's expected, preparation of training materials and administration of additional training for local officials, and preparations for new polling place locations. The authorized uses also allow local governments to purchase new electronic roster systems. So these are the e-poll books that would meet the requirements that are in existing law. And then the big piece in this list of authorized uses here is a grant program for local governments. In subdivision 5, you see the detail for the grant program. This looks largely like the existing grant program that has been used in the recent past for election equipment purchases by local governments. One thing I'll highlight here is paragraph B on line 5.10. You'll see that the grants to local governments using this federal money would be allowed for up to 75% of the total cost of purchasing electronic roster equipment, and then up to 80% of the total cost of the other activities that are authorized in this section of the bill. And then paragraph D on line 5.21, there's a legislative report that was required in January of 2021. And then the appropriations would be available in subdivision 6 under this section until March of 2022, which reflects the amendment you just incorporated into this draft. And Mr. Chair, that's the end of the DE2-1.
And members, I guess now would be the time to discuss the filling in that dots that are there for the time after the election. I know last week when we met, we talked about, we had it at 7 days, and there was this discussion about the number of days after the election that people would be comfortable with having that. And so Representative Albright, do you know where what do you feel about that date? How many days after the election? And we'll get some feedback, get some information from the Secretary of State also. But Representative Albright.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know that we're going to discuss this amendment and 3499 in a greater context, pursuant to some actions taken by the majority overnight with regard to another bill that will be taken up next week. I think this amendment in its broader perspective has been hard fought, we spent a lot of time on this amendment, as Secretary Simon, Representative Dean, Representative Nash, and others can attest to. I would offer that for filling in that blank in the context of that global perspective, I would offer up that we don't need any days after the election.
Okay, Representative Nash, I see you have your hand up. Representative Nash.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to echo what Representative Albright said. Sorry, I'm having a little. I will say yes. The bill amendment that we're looking to incorporate was something that was talked about. Still, obviously, there's some differences of opinion on certain issues, but brought forward some work that we thought was good. But overnight, we saw some things happen that majority leadership decided to really go a different direction. And I will say that from my perspective, that was kind of alarming, disappointing, and is going to probably take today's actions and direction in a much different way. So I would echo what Representative Albright said, that days after the election, I'm at 0, and I think days before has been addressed, but yeah, 0 days after. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Secretary Simon, I think we've had discussions, and you were going to check with the election officials around the state and what they figured was a good number for them. What did you find out in your discussions? You're not unmuted yet.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Is that better? Can you hear me okay now? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Yeah, on this business of how much time is needed afterwards. First, let me address the obvious here. I understand that there's some discomfort and disappointment among GOP members at certain parliamentary maneuvers that they're discussing, and I'm sure we'll discuss in this hearing. But I want to make clear, this isn't this provision about after the election that helps me or helps the DFL. This is your local counties and cities. And I really want to defer, and I hate to ambush her, but I think Ms. Erickson is on the call. I would really benefit, and I think the committee would benefit from her testimony on behalf of all counties and elections administrators, to hear what she has to say about what would happen if the number were 0. If the number were 0 and local elections administrators had no time after the election, 0 time to administer absentee ballots, what, as a practical matter in your counties and cities, not our office, we don't count a single vote. They do, we don't. I'd like to hear from her what she thinks the outcome would be.
Okay, thank you, Representative Secretary Simon. If we could unmute Ms. Erickson. Ms. Erickson, if you can get it, what are your feelings on that number? What should the number be, and why is it important?
Mr. Chair and members, currently under current statute, there is 24 hours that's allowed for election administrators to complete the processing of absentee ballots, which also includes ballots that are mailed in through the mail balloting process, or those who vote by no excuses absentee. We are currently able to work within that framework as it exists right now. There is some concern that if the volume of ballots that are received by mail would be significantly higher than what it currently is, particularly where ballots can be returned up until 3 o'clock on election day for absentee ballots, or 8 p.m. on election day for mail ballot precincts, that it would take a significant amount of time for the absentee ballot board judges to open and process that volume of ballots that might be coming in on that last day. A lot of this will depend on the size of the precinct and the number of volunteers or the number of staff that they can have assigned to this particular issue. We do feel that if there is no change to the mail balloting threshold, if the current statute currently existing is still the statute that is in play for mail balloting purposes, that those precincts that are townships of any size or cities over 400 outside of the metro area, even if there is an increase in mail balloting in some of those areas, there is a concern that we would need a little bit more time to process potentially. I believe that most of our counties have stated that 3 days would be the max of what would be necessary. In some of these areas, the processing is going to include hand feeding ballots into what are typically used as precinct tabulators, because the availability to either purchase or procure a central count system might be challenging at this time across the country, or cost prohibitive at this time for some of our municipalities. And if they do have precinct count equipment that they have available at their counties, they can use that for processing absentee ballots or mail ballots. It does take significantly longer to process them with that system. In fact, we had timed it at one time when my county was still using precinct tabulators. It took 5.3 seconds per ballot to feed it into a tabulator. So the amount of the amount of time after election day is simply to get the ballots opened and counted. It's not expanding how long people have to vote. These are ballots that still have to be received by the deadlines that are currently in statute. This wouldn't change that. It just allows for time to get those ballots counted. We only have limited finite resources when it comes to the equipment and people that we have to be able to process those ballots. And especially if we are concerned about providing social distancing for our staff from the standpoint of not having everybody jammed into one room, shoulder to shoulder with a bank of 10 or 15 tabulators to process, there are some concerns that additional time would be necessary. No more than 3 days would probably be needed at the very most. But as I said, right now, there is 24 hours in the current statute that is allowed for.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Erickson. With that, members, I'm going to modify my amendment to fill that date, that remove those dots. And I'm going to put 3 days in that. That'll give them, as Ms. Erickson said, that'll give them time. We're basically going 2 days longer than what current law is. So members, we're going to fill that in as 3 days. And any more discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chair.
Representative Albright.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary Simon, I want to address my comments a little bit to you, and you're certainly welcome to respond. And I'll continue on from my earlier comments with regard to overnight developments. But as you are aware, protocol and a precedent between the two caucuses has always been to provide for a strongly bipartisan election bill. One that both sides can agree puts the citizen voter at the center of the decision-making process for them, particularly in light of respecting their constitutional rights to vote, whether that be in person or, as is already in statute, through the mail. Developments outside of this amendment certainly break with that tradition. And so with that in mind, Mr. Chair, I would defer to Secretary Simon for his comments about the developments overnight. I know that it may not be germane, but I think in light of the impact that would make on moving any type of a bill forward, I'm a bit concerned about the intentions of the majority in the House in terms of what their focus will be going forward on an elections bill. And I'd certainly like to understand where the Secretary of State's office is coming from. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Secretary Simon, if you could be concise.
Yes, I will.
I get in trouble with that, but can you be concise?
I will try. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I only learned about the developments that you're talking about via a text from Representative Nash late last night. So I didn't know anything about this. So I would defer to others who may have. And just for the benefit of the public or others who don't know what we're talking about, apparently a bill has been scheduled for next week. I want to say the 29th in the Ways and Means Committee. An elections-related bill, which contains all sorts of provision, is authored by the chair of the Elections Committee, Representative Dean. So just so everyone understands what we're talking about, that's it. In my understanding, Representative Albright, Representative Nash, is you're not too happy about that. But I would offer this. That is a shiny object that we should not let deter us from this heavily negotiated and thoroughly bipartisan compromise. Now, this compromise is not everything that I wanted. It's far short of what I wanted. And I continue to say that the number one safest way to conduct an election in a pandemic would be to do the full automatic vote by mail. That is not in here. And there are other things not in here that I would have wanted. And I'm sure there are things in here that Representatives Nash, Albright, and others would have wanted. But this was heavily negotiated, including a big sort of summit meeting on Sunday over the weekend, where a number of us, including you, Mr. Chair, were on the phone, and staff from both caucuses. And we hammered this thing out. This is exactly the way the process should work. This is a thoroughly negotiated, thoroughly bipartisan compromise, which I support because it's something that can actually get enacted into law and give Minnesotans comfort at a time of a pandemic. So that's all I'll say there. I don't want those other developments. I understand the irritation, but I really ask everyone not to let that shiny object deter us from this heavily negotiated and bipartisan compromise.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Albright.
Secretary Simon, I appreciate your candor, and more to the point, I've appreciated your willingness to engage in candid and frank negotiations and a compromise that we did reach over the weekend. So tip of the hat to you. My comments are made, though, in light of this amendment in terms of the direction that the House majority is taking with this, and where that leaves the intent going forward. I'm dismayed. I'm also a bit confused in terms of the developments overnight, and they certainly do put a very large question mark and a detraction from what we all spent an incredible amount of time over the weekend hammering out. So, but thank you, Secretary Simon.
Representative Long. You're next on my list, if you can be short.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will be short. I just wanted to clarify for the dots. I don't know if this is appropriately directed to Matt Gehring or somebody else, but Representative Nash and Albright had both said 0 days. I wanted to clarify, if we went to 0 days, is that worse than current law, the 24 hours that they currently have?
I think Secretary Simon, did you hear the question, Secretary Simon?
It's 0 additional days.
I really would defer to Mr. Gehring on that. I don't know which would trump which.
Mr. Chair, meant to clarify my point for the sake of Representative Long's question. Your question to me was any additional days after what is in state law, not a detraction back to 0 from 24 hours. So Representative Long, my position is that state statute is just fine. We don't need to add any more days. We would stay at the 24 hours. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Gehring, Mr. Gehring, maybe you can answer that. Is that if changing that to 0 days after the election, would that trump current law where they've got 24 hours after the election? Mr. Gehring.
Mr. Chair, so I think if you were to adopt Representative Albright's amendment, we would just make sure that the intent is clear there. That the way that it's drafted right now, it's an option for local governments to extend the processing period. So I think that you could make the case that that the current law would still apply if the local government didn't choose to sort of use this power. So I'm not sure I want to use the words that Representative Long used to characterize the effect, but we could draft it in a way that accommodates Representative Albright's intent.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just wanted to make clear that our shared intent is not to disallow processing after the election. Everybody agrees that processing after the election is worth having for local governments. We just are discussing how many days, and the local governments have said 3 days is what they need in the current pandemic, which makes sense to me. Thank you.
Representative Nash, if we can.
Yeah, I'll be brief.
Make it short, please.
Yes, Mr. Chair. So the Secretary and Representative Albright referenced what happened overnight with the fact that we know that House File 1603 is going to be brought before the committee next week. The all-mail balloting provision is going to be amended into it. And I will echo the concern that I have over what is the intent of House leadership relative to the elections bill. And while the Secretary called this a shiny object, the Secretary is not the Speaker of the House. And the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader apparently have given directions that the position of the House is going to be all-mail balloting and a good number of other things that's in House File 1603. Because of that, from my seat, that casts a huge shadow over this bill. And I will echo what the Secretary said. There are this is a negotiated bill. There are things in here that I'm still not thrilled with. There's some things that we would like to tighten up on HAVA money and different utilizations of that. And obviously we have a disagreement on the number of days after to process absentee ballots. So we figured that some of this would be negotiated further, but negotiations became almost irrelevant overnight when House leadership, who does make the call on what happens and where things go and what bills come to the floor or don't come to the floor, decided that they were going to go in a completely different direction, contrary to the negotiations that we made in good faith. So for that reason, I don't see how we can support this. And I'm very disappointed that people who were not involved in the negotiations just decided to snap their fingers and change absolutely everything. And again, because they are the ones that decide what happens, it's not a shiny object. That House File 1603 is apparently the new House elections bill. So, I think that this is a moot point at this point because that's apparently the bill. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Dean, if you can be short and keep it to the amendment that we're on, not anything that might be coming up at a later date. Representative Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Absolutely, I was involved in a lot of this negotiation to get to this bill that's before us at the moment. And, there are a lot of factors that are playing into where we are today. I would just say that, in the past, in the House, we have not worked as bipartisanly on elections issues as I think many people would have hoped for. This is clearly an example where we have set aside our partisanship and have sat down to negotiate what was best for Minnesota voters. Ultimately, we have an election that's coming up in August and then in November, and Minnesota needs prepared to actually make that happen. And regarding the events that have happened in the last 24 hours or so, I just want to let everyone know and the committee know that I'm supportive of this, not because of all the wonderful things that are in it, albeit there are some good things. I think that, as Representative Nash mentioned, there are some things he's not happy that are in there, and I think there are many other folks that are happy that there are some provisions that aren't in there that we would like to see in there. At the same time, I want all of you to really think hard about Minnesota voters and what we need to do for elections. I certainly understand the disappointment of some members as a result of the decisions of the majority leadership. But I think that this is a good bill. This is evidence of some good work and what can happen when we all enter into a discussion and negotiation on something based on putting the people of Minnesota first. So that would just be my comments. I hope that folks would support this. And, we'll have another time and another day to talk about some of the other issues that have been brought up.
Okay, members, I see no more hands. Members, I'm going to renew my motion that House File 3499, the DE2-1 amendment as modified by the date change and by adding 3 days, no more than 3 days following the election. And Sydney, if you can take the roll.
Chair Nelson.
Yes.
Vice Chair Cleavorn.
Aye.
Representative Albright.
No.
Representative Acom.
Aye.
Representative Elkins.
Aye.
Representative Freiberg.
Yes.
Representative Green.
No.
Representative Hertas.
No.
Representative Hewitt.
Aye.
Representative Jordan.
Aye.
Representative Keel.
No.
Representative Lippert.
Aye.
Representative Long.
Aye.
Representative Mason,
Aye.
Representative Nash,
No.
Representative Olson,
Aye.
Representative Quam,
No.
Representative Vogel,
No.
11 ayes and 7 nays.
The amendment's been adopted. So members, on to discussion of the amendment. Representative Albright.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I believe that we're on the bill as amended.
The bill is amended, correct.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I'll be brief because I know that we have another bill to take up. But I think that I would share Representative Nash and others who have expressed our disappointment in the developments overnight and how they complicate the global perspective of an elections bill, the precedent that it sets, but also the confusion that it establishes also for a direction as we move to the House floor, and also consideration of what the Senate might be doing. Mr. Chair, before we go to a vote for passage of the bill, I would like an opportunity for final comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion? I see no hands up. Representative Nash, I see your hand just went up.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to be brief and I wanted to thank you, Mr. Chair, and Chair Dean for your work in honestly negotiating. And I understand that this was a decision that was not made by you, but you've got to carry the water. I again just think that it's a game of 3-card Monte from House leadership, that we were all negotiating this bill, and it was not everything that everybody wanted. We've all said that, but this was literally a change of the game, or as I said, a game of 3-card Monte, where leadership decided they were going to shuffle up the walnut shells and try to take it out from underneath us. I think that this is a very dishonest action by them, and it was sort of shady. And that's why a bill that I actually helped negotiate, I'm going to be voting no on, because I think that what this says in the larger picture is that irrespective of what members negotiate in good faith with other members, leadership can capriciously snap their fingers and decide to take what is a bipartisan bill and take it in a completely different direction. And to Representative Dean's comment of earlier, yes, last year was a very partisan election bill, and that is contrary to what has been the case for many years. But this was to be a bipartisan bill, and a bipartisan bill is where both sides don't love it but don't hate it, argued for some things to be put in or taken out, and there are still some things that they would rather have not be in there. That's what we did. That's not what we're doing here. Because this, I believe, to use the Secretary's words, this is now the shiny object. And the thing that's going to be coming up on Monday is apparently, as directed by the House leadership, that is the elections bill. So it's going to be very difficult to support this, Mr. Chair. And again, I just thank you for your effort, and Chair Dean for the effort that we put in, and the Secretary. We met and we negotiated, and like I said, came away with some things and didn't come away with things that we wanted. But I can't support this, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Representative Quam, if you can be quick.
Independent of what is in here and what is happening outside, I am very concerned of the lack of addressing election integrity, and would not have voted for this bill independent of what leadership is trying to do on the outside. I think anytime we touch election statute, we must keep in mind that we have to have the public confidence in the election and address election integrity. And I feel that this bill neglects that.
Thank you. I see no further comments. I'll renew my motion that House File 3499 as.
Mr. Chair,
Oh, that's right. Representative Albright, you wanted to say something.
Mr. Chair, I'd make a motion to lay this bill as amended on the table.
A motion has been made to lay this on the table.
I would ask for a roll call if that is appropriate in light of
Well,
digital committee work. So I recognize that it may just required anyway. So
with that, Sydney, Ms. Spreck, can you take the roll? Call the roll. Motion to lay it on the table.
Yep. Chair Nelson,
No.
Vice Chair Kleborn,
No.
Representative Albright,
yes.
Representative Acom,
No.
Representative Elkins,
No.
Representative Freiberg,
No.
Representative Green,
Yes.
Representative Hertas,
Yes.
Representative Hewitt,
No.
Representative Jordan,
No.
Representative Keel,
Yes.
Representative Lippert,
No.
Representative Long,
No.
Representative Mason,
No.
Representative Nash,
Yes.
Representative Olson,
No.
Representative Quam,
Yes.
Representative Vogel.
Yes.
7 ayes and 11 nays.
So members, with that, I'll renew my motion that House File 3499 as amended be passed and move and referred to the Ways and Means Committee. All those, like I said, with Representative Ms. Spreck, if you can call the roll.
Chair Nelson,
Aye.
Vice Chair Kleborn,
Aye.
Representative Albright,
No.
Representative Acom,
Aye.
Representative Elkins,
Aye.
Representative Freiberg,
Yes.
Representative Green, Representative Hertas,
No.
Representative Hewitt,
Aye.
Representative Jordan,
Aye.
Representative Keel,
No.
Representative Lippert,
Aye.
Representative Long,
Aye.
Representative Mason,
Aye.
Representative Nash,
No.
Representative Olson,
Aye.
Representative Quam,
No.
Representative Vogel,
No.
11 ayes and 7 nays.
The motion been approved. It's on its way to Ways and Means.